necessary to look at it from the mountain over there, Pari. One of my motives for pursuing Western academic study of Buddhism, in other words, has been to try and gain both an emic and ethic perspective of Buddhism. Second, my knowledge of Buddhism has been based exclusively on Buddhist sources in Tibetan translation, and it somehow seemed unsatisfactory to rely only on sources in Tibetan translation and not to be able to trace the doctrinal roots in the original, whenever possible, of course. In sum, it was my desire to try and read Buddhist sources in the original, mainly Sanskrit, and to learn Western academic methods that brought me to the Department of Indian and Tibetan Studies at the University of Hamburg. Retrospectively, however, it occurs to me that it has been naive to assume that there is just one Western academic approach of studying Buddhism. It did not take long to realize that one could study Buddhism in the Western academia in different disciplines and departments. One could study Buddhism as a student of religious studies, philosophy, social anthropology, sociology, literature, and so forth. My destiny, so to speak, however, brought me to the Western academic system in Hamburg, in Germany, which is defined and profiled by its rigor and fame in the appreciation and application of historical, philological methods. While the standards set by the giants in the field of Buddhist studies may be difficult to be met by scholars such as myself, the arguments for the need to investigate various aspects of Buddhism, particularly Buddhist religion, philosophy, intellectual history, and intellectual culture, based on textual material from the past and the employment of historical philological tools and techniques, seem more than appealing and compelling. When I took up the position as a professor for Tibetology, I was expected to define the profile and focus of Tibetan studies at the department. Despite the tendency and pressure today to de-emphasize the text-based study of Buddhist religion and philosophy, I made a commitment to follow the footsteps of my predecessors in maintaining a strong historical philological tradition of Tibetan Buddhist studies, for which the department is well known. In keeping with this commitment and the vision and support of the Khyentse Foundation, we have been able to establish the Khyentse Center for Tibetan Buddhist Textual Scholarship at the department in January 2011. As one of its several academic activities, the center organized and conducted this summer a symposium on a very identical topic, cross-cultural transmission of Buddhist texts, theories and practices of translation. That is from July 23rd to 25th, 2012, University of Hamburg, which has been a very rewarding experience for myself and so I hope for other participants as well. It is at the backdrop of this brief history that I venture to present a rationale of Buddhist textual scholarship, that is, so to speak, a philosophy of Buddhist philology, by trying to answer three questions, namely, what do I mean by Buddhist textual scholarship, and why and how is one supposed to practice it? Although my own field of interest and engagement is textual studies, mainly within the area of Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, I hope that the issues that I address today would be of relevance not only to Buddhist textual scholarship in general, but also to the specific related issues such as theories and practices of critical edition and translation, to which this current conference is mainly devoted, and which ought to be of interest to those of us engaged in the investigation of the histories of the cross-cultural transmission of Buddhist texts and ideas conveyed therein. Let us now turn to the first question. What is Buddhist textual scholarship? The expression textual scholarship is understood and employed here as described and defined by David C. Gritham in his book Textual Scholarship in the Introduction, 1994. What Gritham obviously intends to achieve with the employment of the term textual scholarship is to co-opt it for, I cite, for the procedures of enumerative bibliographies, descriptive, analytical, and historical bibliographers, paleographers and codicologists, textual editors and annotators, cumulatively and collectively, perhaps a field somewhat like the old philology of an earlier dispensation, the technical and conceptual recreation of the past through the text, specifically through the language of those texts, end quote. Gritham himself seems to be inspired by G. Thomas Tansell for his states, I'm quoting a rather long quote, in part, the employment of the term textual scholarship in this general sense is a recognition that textual criticism is associated with the great tradition of classical and biblical studies and forms but one branch of textual scholarship as a whole. In part, it is a recognition that the various contributions of paleographers, codicologists, bibliographers, editors, and so on are related to what elsewhere Tansell referred to as single great enterprise, common to them all, the historical investigation of text as both artifactual objects and conceptual entities, and the reconstruction of those stages in the transmission that have not survived. Further on, end quote, further on, Gritham defines textual scholarship as as a general term for all the activities, quoting, associated with the discovery, description, transcription, editing, annotating, and commenting upon texts. Textual scholarship thus has a wider reference than textual criticism, that part of the discipline concerned with evaluation and emendation of the reading of the text, may involve any of the technical fields listed in the opening sentence, end quote. But so I'll mention what he mentions in the opening sentence. Our bibliography, and he has a lot of classes of bibliographies: enumerative, systematic, descriptive, analytical, historical, and textual. And then textual analysis, textual criticism, textual editing, documentary editing, social textual criticism, epigraphy, paleography, codicology, diplomatics, philology, historical criticism, and higher and lower criticism. Presupposing the definition of textual scholarship we have just seen, Buddhist textual scholarship may be defined here as an academic discipline within the domain of the humanities. I want to deliberately use the German word Geisteswissenschaften for humanities, that it may be defined as an academic discipline within the Geisteswissenschaften, whose ultimate goal is the investigation and explanation of the intellectual history, that is Geistesgeschichte, and intellectual culture, Geisteskultur, of a society impregnated with Buddhist religion and philosophy as its main goal, and B, whose main research material consists of written texts or written sources, transmitted through the medium of manuscripts, xylographs, epigraphs, inscriptions, modern books, and so on, and C, whose methodology is defined by the employment of historical, philological tools and techniques, which presuppose a profound knowledge of languages and cultures in which the pertinent text has originated and through which it has been transmitted and disseminated. Let us now turn to the second question. Why pursue Buddhist textual scholarship? Posing such a question is almost tantamount to asking three philosophical questions related to ontology, here, theory and study of being, epistemology, theory or study of knowledge, and axiology, theory or study of values. First, is there at all anything that what one might call realities such as artifactual and conceptual entities, activities, and events? Second, Even if we assume the existence of such realities of the past, are they knowable? Can we know them? In other words, can one reconstruct and know these entities and events from the past? And if so, how? Third, even if we are somehow able to recreate and know the past entities and events, is there any value in such a knowledge? And if so, what kind of value? The very existence of modern education systems and academic disciplines seems to be indicative of the fact that we do not and cannot deny that entities, activities, and events do exist in a certain space and time, and that we cannot only know them, but there is some value in knowing them. Most, if not all, ancient Indian philosophers, including Buddhist philosophers, also seem to have taken for granted the existence of various layers or dimensions of reality, the knowability or cognizability of reality, and the utility of gaining cognitive access to reality. In other words, for Indian philosophers, only what is ontically or ontologically possible is epistemically cognizable, and only what is epistemically cognizable is ontically existent. A direct ontic epistemic correspondence seems to have been taken for granted. Most important of all, while Buddhist philosophers may or may not ascribe an intrinsic value to knowledge or valid cognition, most of them would not deny its instrumental value, inasmuch as it is assumed to contribute to or cause the attainment of mundane and supramundane goals of human beings, and ultimately in making the soterical spiritual breakthrough or release from the bondage of existence. The first fundamental assumption of Buddhist textual scholarship is that texts from various Buddhist cultures transmitted to us do contain certain Buddhist ideas, be they be religious, philosophical, or otherwise, and that their authors did intend to convey these certain ideas. Analogous to our own selves who intend to convey something by means of our oral or written text, it is quite reasonable to assume that also an author of the text that we investigate, be it written, translated, or transmitted in whatever language, wish to convey very specific ideas. It is also to be assumed that similar to a person, texts and ideas are not static entities, but they do possess a history of their own. That is a whole series of events related to their inception, progression, transmission, dissemination, and reception. The second assumption is that the possibility of reconstructing or explaining the history of the text and ideas in a plausible or conceivable manner. Like in any scientific method, in any scientific method of investigation, it is possible for textual scholars to propose scientific hypotheses based on critical evaluation of evidences which are subject to verification or falsification. The knowability, or rather the reconstructibility of the history of texts and ideas is, in my view, based on the efficacy of language as means of communication. Language, for several reasons, may not be the absolute means of communication, but it is certainly one of the most effective communication tools, and often the only practical one. The degree of success in determining and explaining the history of texts and ideas would depend, of course, on a number of factors, not the least on our own language proficiency and efficiency of tools and techniques that we employ. The third assumption why we ought to practice Buddhist textual scholarship is based on the recognition that the full evaluation and appreciation of a civilization is perhaps only possible through a nuanced understanding of history, particularly its intellectual history. Without a cumulative and collective knowledge of or memory of the history of its intellectual culture, it would be as though humanity were suffering from Alzheimer's disease. According to the maxim, the past is all pervasive, we can hardly talk about Buddhist religion or philosophy without considering its history. We may choose to ignore or deny history, but a denial of history is a denial of responsibility. As students of textual scholarship, it is our privilege and duty to make an honest attempt to understand what the texts are trying to tell us, and to explain how the thought contained and transmitted in them came into being and how they developed. This in turn is based on the tacit assumption that the depth of our understanding of Buddhist ideas transmitted in the form of written text is dependent on the quality of Buddhist textual scholarship. Let us now turn to the third question, namely, how is one supposed to practice Buddhist textual scholarship? During my studies in Hamburg, my teachers pointed out that one cannot learn philology with the help of manuals. Just as an apprentice learns a trade from his or her master, so does one learn philology from one's master by way of a guided practice. Although the best textual scholarship is a practical textual scholarship, it doesn't mean that there's no need to constantly reflect on the methodology involved with it. It would be beyond the scope of this paper to try to discuss the tools, techniques, and methods of textual scholarship. What I thus merely seek to address in a few points regarding some general methodological presuppositions and policies, and a few remarks on the issues of critical edition and translation. First, as a general methodological principle or policy in the field of Buddhist studies, or in fact, in any area of cultural studies, I believe that it is no longer illuminative and constructive to pursue methodology-related academic discourses in terms of Orientalism, Occidentalism, Eastern, Western, we, they, our, their dichotomies. Extreme forms of Orientalism, marked, for instance, by an attitude or assumption that the Buddhist or someone from the Buddhist tradition or culture can never be an objective Buddhologist, just as a bird can never be an ornithologist, is as problematic as extreme forms of Occidentalism, marked, for instance, by an attitude or assumption that someone who is not a practicing Buddhist or someone from outside the Buddhist tradition or culture can never really know or understand Buddhist teachings, and hence can never be an authority in the field of Buddhist studies. At least in principle, both Eastern and Western, ancient and modern traditions, both Eastern and Western, ancient and modern traditions of inquiry seems to propose or presuppose that the very objective of inquiry is to illuminate the state of affairs as it is, and to gain correct and complete insight into it. It is thus to be assumed that anyone from anywhere endowed with the intellectual curiosity and a benevolent will to gain insight into the state of affairs, regardless of whether that insight turns out to be in conform with one's own prejudices, positive or negative, will be able to contribute to increasing and enhancing the cumulative knowledge or collective knowledge of human civilization, provided the inquirer or investigator has access to the necessary resources, tools, techniques, and training. In the particular case of Buddhist textual scholarship, although the proficiency in the pertinent research language is the most important tool or means, and skillful employment of historical philological methods, the main research technique, a textual scholar should be open to any discipline or methodology that brings one a step closer to one's goal. Undoubtedly, critical editing or preparing a critical edition of a text is the most important activity and duty of a textual scholar. Over centuries, seasoned scholars from the fields of mainly, but not exclusively, classical studies, and biblical studies have already deliberated on the theories and practices of critical edition within the context of textual criticism. Also, practicing textual scholars from the fields of classical Indian, that is mainly Sanskrit studies, Sanskrit and Pali studies, and Buddhist studies, have reflected and written on the issues related to the theories and practices of critical edition. My personal wish is that what are known as lower criticism, that is textual criticism, the ultimate aim of which is the preparation of a critical edition, contains